after the Lombardy experiment, in October 1796 he presided over the creation of a Cispadane Republic, incorporating Modena, Ferrara, Reggio and Bologna, to be confirmed by an elected assembly in December. This became a reality in February 1797 after final Austrian defeat, the capitulation of the Pope, and his cession of Bologna, Ferrara and the Romagna and the Treaty of Tolentino on the 19th of February 1797. At the end of 1796 Napoleon explained his thinking on the Transpadane Republic to the Directory, and again revealed himself a master of political Machiavellianism. The Cispadana Republic is divided into 3 parties: 1 the friends of their former government, 2 the partisans of an independent but rather aristocratic constitution, 3 the partisans of the French constitution and of pure democracy. I repress the first, I support the second, and moderate the third. I do so because the second is the party of the rich landowners and priests, who in the long run will end by winning the support of the mass of the people, which it is essential to rally around the French party. There is much evidence that Napoleon trod very carefully in Italy when the Roman Catholic Church was involved. In answer to the taunts of the anticlericals in February 1797 for failing to enter Rome and depose the Pope, he explained that the combination of the 30 million franc indemnity and the loss of Bologna, Ferrara and the Romagna amounted to the euthanasia of the papacy. Yet at the very same time he wrote warmly to the Pope in terms that made it clear he had no such expectation of the imminent demise of the Vatican as temporal power. There were even times when he wondered whether he had been too soft on the Catholic Church, for the elections in the Cispadane Republic showed how strong was the influence of the Church. On the 1st of May 1797 Napoleon wrote to the Directory about the disappointing results in the ballot. Priests have influenced all the electors. In the villages they dictate the lists and control all the elections. I shall take steps in harmony with their customs to enlighten opinion and lessen the influence of the priests. By this time signs of strain were evident between Napoleon and the Directory over Italian policy. The directors thought Italy too backward to republicanize and such a policy likely to antagonize Austria permanently. But Napoleon seemed impressed by the republican spirit and the commitment to his cause and was contemptuous of Austria. Napoleon won the struggle and began the move to fuse the Lombardy government and the Cispadane Republic into a greater Cisalpine Republic. By July 1, 797 most of the territory Napoleon had conquered in Italy was united in the new Cisalpine state, with an elaborate constitution patterned on the French one, complete with 5 directors and a bicameral legislature of ancients and juniors. The murder of pro-French Democrats in Genoa in May 1797 gave Napoleon the excuse he needed to intervene there too. He set up a Ligurian republic, with 12 senators, a doge and 2 elective chambers. Napoleon's desire to promote an incorporating union of Italian states was, however, always predicated on his power struggle with the directors. About the thing in itself he was cynical. In October 1797 he wrote to Talleyrand, "You do not know the Italian people. They are not worth the lives of 40,000 Frenchmen. Since I came to Italy I have received no help from this nation's love of liberty and equality, or at least such help has been negligible. Here are the facts. Whatever is good to say in proclamations and printed speeches is romantic fiction." In August, too, having carried his point with the directors, he changed his line in communication with them and argued that the islands of Corfu, Zante and Cephalonia were much more important to the French national interest than the whole of Italy put together. Presumably his reasoning was that the islands were important centers on Mediterranean and eastern trade routes and could generate continuing wealth, whereas Italy had already been bled dry. His cynicism was borne out in 1798 when the Republican experiment in Italy collapsed virtually overnight. His changing attitude to Italy during 1797, moving from sanguine euphoria to cynical defeatism, was almost certainly the result of the tortuous 6-month negotiation with Austria, when he and the Directory seemed to be more concerned with winning the power struggle in France than forcing the Austrians to sign a final treaty. Each of the 5 directors had good reason to be suspicious of their victorious general, but in addition the Directory was divided against itself in a political imbroglio of frightening complexity. Of the 5 directors, Barras wanted peace at any price, while Rubel, the only true ex-Jacobin among them, wanted to continue the revolutionary policy of exporting the ideas of '89. Neither saw eye to eye with Bonaparte, for Barras thought Napoleon too hardline in his dealings with the Austrians, while Rubel wanted to sacrifice the gains in Italy to secure France her natural frontiers on the Rhine. Yet overlying these conflicts was an even more menacing development. In May 1797 France lurched rightwards, as signaled by the elections to the legislative councils. This was hard on the heels of the execution of Gracchus Babeuf, who had plotted to destroy the Directory and replace it with an extreme democratic communistic system. Of the 2 standard-bearers of the new right, Fran Lesserthan, Oise Barthélemy entered the Directory, while General Charles Pichegru, as president of the 500, openly intrigued for a royalist restoration. In Paris signs of rightist reaction were palpable, churches were reopening, the tricolour was seldom seen, 17, and the title of citizen used only ironically. Disabled or wounded veterans of the Army of Italy found on their return that they were insulted or worse if they did not cry, "Long live the King." Napoleon followed internal events in France closely. As he saw it, there were three main power groupings in Paris: the determined Republicans who sided with the majority in the Directory, the out-and-out Royalists led by Pichegru and Barthélemy, and a cabal of don't-knows clustered round the Clichy Club and led by Lazare Carnot. It was this latter group that particularly incensed Napoleon. Royalists he could understand, but he despised fence-sitters. The Clichy party represented themselves as wise, moderate, good Frenchmen. Were they Republicans? No. Were they Royalists? No. They were for the Constitution of 1791. Then, no, for that of 1793, still less, that of 1795 perhaps. Yes and no. What were they then? They themselves did not know. They would have consented to such a thing, but, to another, if however, he suspected Carnot and Barthélemy of being the most dangerous of the five directors. Carnot because he hated the Thermidorians and resented their assiduous propaganda that all the bloodshed in the revolution was due to the men of 93. Barthélemy because he was the front man for Pichegru, whom Napoleon suspected of wanting to play General Monk in a Bourbon restoration. For their part, the directors had various grievances against Bonaparte. The so-called rape of Venice still rankled. Representative Dumoulard in the Tribune of the 500 denounced the commander-in-chief of the Army of Italy for intervening in Venice and Genoa without the authority of the Directory and the assemblies and without even consulting them. The new incumbents in political office denounced his looting in Italy, doubtless because they came too late to share in the spoils. The unconstitutional offer of terms to the Austrians at Leoben was raked over and the prospect of an imminent peace laughed to scorn. Most of the Parisian journals were anti-Bonaparte and plugged away at the shame of his Venetian policy. Some went so far as to deny that any Frenchman had ever been massacred in Verona. Another motif was that a restoration of the monarchy would bring a lasting European peace. There was some warrant for this assertion, for war weariness in England was palpable. Even the Francophobe firebrand Pitt was prepared to discuss terms and sent Lord Malmesbury to Paris to negotiate with the new French foreign minister, Talleyrand. The war was not going England's way. The French invasion of Ireland in 1796 had come within an ace of success, and was thwarted only by storms. Spain went over to the French side in the same year, causing the Royal Navy to withdraw from the Mediterranean. And at home there was financial crisis, and a possible harbinger of general social unrest in the shape of the Nore and Spithead naval mutinies, which struck at the heart of Britain's traditional first line of defense. Pitt made it clear that Napoleon's actions in Italy were a sticking point, and this was played up in royalist propaganda. Napoleon had three principal weapons of counter-offensive. In the first place, he had his own press and his own tame organs of propaganda. His two newspapers, distributed free to soldiers in the army of El Tali, and even smuggled into France itself and distributed widely and gratis thereto, were Le Courrier de l'Armée d'Italie ou Le Patriote and La France Vue de l'Armée d'Italie, of which the former was edited by an ex-Jacobin who had been involved in the Babeuf conspiracy. Le Courrier was aimed at the crypto-Jacobites in the army of El Tali and stressed the way the revolution was being betrayed by the rightward swing in France. Le France, on the other hand, was aimed at moderate opinion and stressed the qualities of Napoleon himself as leader and thaumaturge. The very real achievement in the Italian campaign was exaggerated tenfold, to the point where all Napoleon's errors were deliberate mistakes designed to lure the enemy to his doom. It has been well said that the Napoleonic legend was born, not on St. Helena, but in Italy. The Bonapartist press liked to portray known opponents of Napoleon, like Dumoulard and Mallet du Pan, as English agents in the pay of Pitt. By the time the right appeared as the ascendant power in France in May 1797, Napoleon had founded a third newspaper, this time in Paris, using the vast booty he had accumulated in Italy. This one was called Journal de Bonaparte et des Hommes Verdus. He kept in reserve the secret that his spies had intercepted correspondence from the most important royalist agent, the Comte d'Entraigues, implicating Pichegru and other rightist figures in France. For the moment he contented himself with a formal letter of protest to the Directory, complaining that he was being persecuted by jealous souls purely because of his great services for the Republic. Accusing Dumoulard of being a stalking horse for the émigrés, he enclosed with his letter a dagger, symbolizing the dagger aimed at his heart by the 500. The second major weapon of retaliation against the right was the alliance Napoleon built up with Barras, using as middleman the newly returned French ambassador to the USA, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the wily and Machiavellian Talleyrand, whose name would later be a byword for double-dealing, quickly sized up the political situation on his return and saw that Napoleon was the key. Another newly returned exile, Madame Germaine de Stade, was part of this circle and worked earnestly for a Barras-Bonaparte alliance, even sending to Italy gushing letters of admiration for the commander of the army there, which succeeded only in alienating Napoleon by their impertinence. Officially, Napoleon encouraged the alliance with his one-time benefactor. He acquiesced when Josephine wrote to her ex-lover to stress that her husband was of one mind with him. Beres responded by appointing Joseph Bonaparte, engaged in Paris in some lucrative real estate speculations, as the Directory's envoy in Madrid. Yet, despite these emollient superficial contacts, Napoleon was in no hurry to do Beres's dirty work for him. If he acted too quickly to extirpate Beres's enemies, he might find the moderate directors too well entrenched on his return to Paris, and that did not square with his own already vaulting political ambitions. The truth was that he despised Beres, Rubel and Lervilliers only slightly less than Carnot and Barthélemy, and referred to the five as five little city courts, placed side by side and disturbed by the passions of the women, the children and the servants. Napoleon's table talk often focused on the alleged mindlessness of the directors, and a favorite example was their attempt to reform weights and measures and introduce decimalization. Napoleon liked to tell his bemused comrades that, as a mathematician, he knew better. Complex numbers were better attuned to the deep structure of the human imagination, as witness the fact that the number 10 had only two factors, 5 and 2, whereas the complex number 12 had 4, 2, 3, 4 and 6. In conversations with Miet de Melito at Mamelo that summer, Napoleon made his contempt for all five directors explicit. Do you believe that I triumph in Italy for the Carnots, Beres, etc.? I wish to undermine the Republican Party, but only for my own profit and not that of the ancient dynasty. As for me, my dear Mitt, I have tasted authority, and I will not give it up. I have decided that if I cannot be the master, I will leave France. But it's too early now, the fruit is not yet ripe. Peace would not be in my interest right now. I would have to give up this power. If I leave the signing of peace treaties to another man, he would be placed higher in public opinion than I am by my victories. Napoleon's third, and most obvious weapon against the rightists was his victorious army of Italy. He now had his soldiers' intense loyalty, partly because he had paid them half their wages in cash and allowed them to loot, partly because he was head of an ever-victorious army, and partly because they had been brainwashed by Napoleonic propaganda. Bonaparte could not only appeal over the heads of the Directory to the people of France but, like a Roman legionary commander of old, launch his cohorts against his country's capital, if that became necessary. Over and over again he referred to the 80,000 heroes who were just waiting for the chance to defend the Constitution against royalist conspirators, cowardly lawyers and miserable chatterboxes. On the 14th of July there appeared this ominous proclamation to the army of Italy: mountains separate us from France, but if it were necessary to uphold the Constitution, to defend liberty, to protect the government and the Republicans, then you would cross them with the speed of an eagle. The resolution of the struggle for power on the Directory between right and left took an unconscionable time, partly because Beres and Talleyrand dithered about whether they really wanted to use Napoleon as their sword to settle accounts with Carnot and Barthélemy. There were only two other possible candidates in mid-79, Bernadotte and Hoche. Bernadotte was soon out of the running because of his putative ultra-Jacobin views, but for a long time Beres favored Lazare Hoche as his hatchetman. Beres's plan was to make Hoche Minister of War as a prelude to a military coup, but this plan was leaked to the councils, and Hoche became temporarily the prime target for the pro-royalist journals. Something happened to him at this stage, which is most charitably described as going to pieces. A man who lived for honor and prestige, Hoche could not take the virulent assault on his reputation and buckled under the strain. Not yet 30, he seemed suddenly to have the vigor of a man of 70 and capped all by dying in mysterious circumstances. Some said it was melancholia, depression and despair that broke his heart. Others claimed he was swept away by tuberculosis, while still others subscribed to the persistent canard that he had been poisoned by persons or factions unknown. Beres now had no choice, if he wanted to survive, than to turn to Bonaparte. Delighted by the turn of fortune which had wiped out a dangerous rival, Napoleon sent Augereau to Paris with an unambiguous message: if you fear the royalists, call for the army of Italy who will swiftly wipe out the Chouans, the royalists and the English. The brilliance of this move was that Napoleon accepted his role as Beres's sword and thus preempted an alliance between the directors and any other general, while holding himself aloof from the direct fray, so that it could never be said that he had once again put down a rising of the people of Paris. Augereau proved an efficient arm of Bonaparte's wrath. During the night of 17-18 Fructidor, in concert with Beres, Rubel and La Revillière, he surrounded the Tuileries with troops, forced the councils to decree the arrest of Barthélemy and Carnot and annulled the results of the recent elections. Carnot escaped in his nightshirt through the garden to exile, but Barthélemy and Pichegru were arrested. 63 marked men of the right were proscribed and deported in iron cages to the penal colony in Guyana, that bourne from which few travelers returned. Draconian new laws against emigrants and royalists threatened a return of the terror. As justification for all this, Augereau posted up on the walls of the city the incriminating correspondence between D'Entraigues and Pichegru which Napoleon had been holding in reserve as his trump card. The legend of the egregious corruption of the Directory dates from Napoleon's masterly use of press propaganda. Naturally, the 5 directors were corrupt, venal and ineffectual, but in terms of rapacity they were nowhere alongside the French generals in Italy, the Bonapartes and, it must be said, Napoleon himself. Their worst fault was to give Napoleon carte blanche in Italy and to make no attempt to stop him when he used his almost absolute power to intervene in internal French politics. However, even Napoleon's enemies must accept that the opposition in the 500 to his Italian policy was either overtly royalist, or was being manipulated by monarchists, whose aim was the overthrow of the constitution. In such a context, bluster about Bonaparte's proxy despotism at Fructidor is out of place. Fructidor destroyed the monarchist faction and brought to a head the latent tension between Napoleon and Barras's party. Fortunately, perhaps, the Austrians seemed unaware of the latter nuance, and had pinned all their hopes on the triumph of the rightists in Paris. This is the context in which the protracted negotiations, and sustained Austrian stalling that summer should be seen. Some of the prevarications of the foppish Austrian plenipotentiary the Marquis of Gallo at the talks that summer in Milan reached opera bouffe proportions. Napoleon played along, for until he had crushed the monarchists in France he did not want a treaty signed. The result was a lazy, sensuous summer at Memelo which many of the Bonaparte entourage remembered as the happiest time of their lives. Josephine was in her element, for her husband indulged her love of animals by constructing a menagerie for her in the vast grounds. However, Napoleon did not extend this indulgence to all animals. Josephine's friend, the poet and playwright Antoine Arnault, remembered the general's joy when the beloved cur Fortune was killed by a cook's dog. Josephine ordered the culprit banned from Memelo Park, but Napoleon restored both cook and animal. "Bring him back," he said. "Perhaps he will rid me of the new dog too." In August the stalled peace talks moved to Pesariano near Venice. After a tour of Lake Maggiore, Napoleon removed there on the 22nd of August. Josephine found an excuse to remain in Milan, where she spent 9 days in dalliance with Hippolyte Charles before he departed on leave. She then condescended to rejoin her husband. After Fructidor, Napoleon moved quickly to settle matters both with the Austrians and the Directory. In secret correspondence, Talleyrand warned him he would have to move fast, as Barras and Rubel opposed his ideas on the treaty, and in particular would never agree to ceding Venice. Augereau, meanwhile, forgetting who had made him, began imagining himself the true author of Fructidor, and started criticizing his leader. Napoleon cut the Gordian knot by sending an impassioned letter to the Directory, stressing that there could be no peace unless his proposals about Venice were accepted. If the directors did not like this, they should replace him. "I beg you to replace me and accept my resignation. No power on earth could make me continue to serve after this dreadful sign of ingratitude from the government, which I was far from expecting. My health needs rest and quiet. My soul also needs to be nourished by contact with the great mass of ordinary citizens. For some time great power has been entrusted to me and I have always used it for the good of the country, whatever those who do not believe in honor and impugn mine might say. A clear conscience and the plaudits of posterity are my reward." This letter was written on the 23rd of September. The Directory received it 7 days later. Barras and Rubel were placed in an impossible situation. Their position was not yet secure enough to be able to dispense with a sword, and all other possible candidates had to be ruled out. Jourdan and Moreau for suspected sympathy with the ousted faction of monarchists, Augereau because he daily manifested himself as a vainglorious loudmouth, and Bernadotte because he seemed to be ultra-Jacobin M sympathies. Barras and Rubel had no choice but to accede to Napoleon's demands. The day after receiving his ultimatum, they in effect gave him carte blanche to conclude the treaty. It was time to deal firmly with the Austrians, already demoralized as the implications of Fructidor sank in. The new Austrian plenipotentiary Ludwig Cobenzl was an even more consummate artist of diplomatic procrastination than his predecessor, frequently nitpicking over points of protocol and seeking by every means to drag out the talks in hopes that something, perhaps a new English initiative, might turn up. In the end, Napoleon lost his temper with the delaying tactics. When Cobenzl disingenuously claimed that the Austrian emperor had no power to dispose of the destinies of the Rhine states, Napoleon exploded. "Your emperor is nothing but an old maidservant accustomed to being raped by everyone." He picked up a precious tea service, a gift to Cobenzl from the Russian Empress Catherine, and smashed it on the ground. "This is what will happen to your monarchy." Shaken by this outburst and advised by his government that there was no power in France that could oppose Bonaparte, Cobenzl signed terms. On the 17th of October the Peace of Campo Formio was signed. Austria ceded Belgium and recognized the Cisalpine Republic, which included Bologna, Modena, Ferrara and the Romagna. As a sop, Austria was given Venice, Styria and Dalmatia, but France retained the Ionian Islands. In a secret article, Austria agreed to support the French claim to the left bank of the Rhine at a congress to be held at Rastatt. Wiser heads in France saw that this treaty was scarcely the glittering triumph portrayed by the Bonapartist press. The original war aims of natural frontiers had been transmogrified into Napoleon's quixotic dream for a new Italy, and the destruction of Venice was widely seen as a blot on French honor. Worst of all, Austria had been left with a foothold in Italy, which was bound to cause conflict in future, and, in general, the empire that had sustained so many reverses in Italy had got away astonishingly lightly. There were many who agreed with another rising political star, the Abbé Manuel Sieyes. I believe that the Directory was to dictate the conditions of peace to Austria, but I see now that it is rather Austria which has imposed them on France. This peace is not a peace, it is a call for a new war. It took 4 hours of impassioned discussion before the directors agreed to ratify Campo Formio. They wanted to oppose Napoleon, but he had the military power, and their resources were uncertain. Besides, a great wave of relief swept over war-weary France, and the tide of public opinion was running so strongly in favor of peace and Bonaparte that the executive did not dare to oppose it. Their foremost fear now was that the Corsican ogre would soon be back in Paris. To forestall this, they announced that the commander in Italy was to be given 2 new honors. He was simultaneously appointed plenipotentiary to the Rastatt Conference and nominated commander of the Army of England, the would-be invasion force collecting in the Channel ports. Though proud of the honor conferred on him, Napoleon was under no illusions about the directors. In Turin on the 19th of November he confessed to Miet de Melito, "The Parisian lawyers who have been put in the Directory understand nothing of government. They are mean-minded men. I doubt that we can stay friends much longer. They are jealous of me. I can no longer obey. I have tasted command and I would not know how to give it up." The appetite for power shows Napoleon already not letting the right hand know what the left hand was doing. For a month earlier he had written to Talleyrand from Milan that he was so exhausted he could barely get into the saddle, and needed 2 years' rest and recuperation. On 6 November 1797 Napoleon left Milan to head northwards through Switzerland to the conference at Rastatt. After traveling via Chambéry, Geneva and Bern he arrived at Rastatt only to be advised that the Directory wished to confer with him urgently in Paris about the proposed invasion of England. Napoleon tarried 4 days, then sent word on the 30th of November that he would be leaving within 48 hours. He was traveling without his wife, for Josephine had seen another opportunity to be alone with Hippolyte Charles. She pretended she wanted to visit Rome, and Napoleon had arranged for a quasi-regal reception there by the peripatetic Joseph, who had meanwhile been appointed by the Directory as their envoy to the Holy See. But as soon as Napoleon left for Turin on 6 November, Josephine changed her mind about Rome. She got Marmont to accompany her instead to Venice, where she was feted like royalty by more than onlookers. To the surprise of no one who knew Madame Bonaparte well, by pure coincidence also in Venice was Hippolyte Charles. However, Josephine was now skating on dangerously thin ice. At Rastatt, Napoleon's spies informed him of what was afoot. There were rumors that Charles was to be executed by firing squad. In fact, Napoleon curtly ordered Charles to report to Paris at once and await further orders. But the ingenious Josephine was not so easily balked. She contrived to intercept the courier bearing these orders, none other than her old friend General Berthier, at an Alpine wayside inn, and got the orders were written so that Charles was granted a 3-month leave in Paris to attend to family business. Josephine then proceeded at a snail's pace through southern France while Charles, alerted, rode several post horses into the ground from Milan to Lyons in pursuit of her. He finally caught up with her at Nevers on the 28th of December. For 5 days and nights, proceeding as slowly as possible towards Paris, they made love, so that it was the 2nd of January 1798 before Josephine finally arrived in Paris. She was a month overdue, for Napoleon, who had arrived in Paris at 5 p.m. on the 5th of December after traveling through eastern France incognito, had been expecting her daily in the Rue Chantereine. On arrival in the French capital, he made a point of meeting Talleyrand as his very first item of business. In the early days the entente between Bonaparte and Talleyrand was a true meeting of minds, and their first encounter, in the grand salon of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was marred only by the presence of the pushy Germain de Stade. Napoleon cut her and concentrated instead on Talleyrand's other guest, the celebrated Pacific navigator Admiral de Bougainville, the man whose reports from Tahiti in I-767 had done most to boost the cult of the noble savage. Only after a long consultation did Napoleon and Talleyrand go on to the Directory to meet his 5 nominal overlords. There he was received warmly by Barras and Le Reveliere, more coolly but still amicably by Rubel, but in frozen silence by the two new men, Merlin and Frank, Oise de Neufchâteau. Napoleon was now the focus for hysterical hero worship as the ideal citizen soldier, a kind of melange of George Washington and Cincinnatus. While he pondered his next move, Napoleon cultivated the image of a demigod, above the small change of quotidian politics, linked to no faction or party. At a dinner party on December he was in sparkling polymath form, discussing metaphysics with Sieyes, poetry with Marie-Joseph Chenier and mathematics with his old teacher Laplace. But the more he remained above the melee, the more intense was the desire of Parisians to catch a glimpse of him. The entrances to his house in the Rue Chantereine were sealed off with judiciously placed porters' lodges. Inside his fortress Napoleon seethed at Josephine's absence, and at the bills presented by the decorator and cabinet maker George Jacob for refurbishments done at Josephine's request. Even on St. Helena he bridled at the bill from Jacob of IJO francs for custom-built salon furniture alone. After enjoying a quasi-Roman triumph in the Luxembourg, where he was introduced by Talleyrand to cheering crowds and made a short non-committal speech in response to Barras's exhortation to him to lead his legions across the Channel, Napoleon got down to the serious business of planning the invasion of England. Much had happened on this front since his departure for Italy. In December 796 an invasion force under Hoche, strong in 45 ships, and carrying Wolfe Tone the Irish revolutionary leader, set out for Bantry Bay. The fleet evaded the Royal Navy and reached landfall, all bar the frigate carrying Hoche himself. The army commander General Grouchy took the fateful decision not to disembark his forces until Hoche arrived. After lying indolently at anchor for 3 days, the invasion fleet was hit by a severe storm which sent them scuttling back to France. 2 months later, in Wales, Hoche tried again, this time sending an army of convicts to disembark on the Pembroke coast. But when Tate's Black Legion surrendered after 3 days, Hoche's reputation took another knock. There were those who claimed that these two fiascos precipitated him into terminal depression. On the 21st of December 1797 Napoleon got down to serious planning at the Ministry of Marine. In close conference with him was the head of the United Irishmen, Wolfe Tone, who had had such a close call in the Great Storm at Bantry Bay 12 months earlier. Tone was not impressed by Bonaparte's grasp of the politics and geography of the British Isles, and reported with derision that the Corsicans seemed to imagine that the population of Ireland was less than 2 million. 2 days later Tone continued uncertain whether the appointment of this new invasion commander boded ill or well for the United Irishmen. He reported that Napoleon was cold and distant, said little, seemed bored and appeared to mask his indifference to Irish affairs under a mask of courteousness and hyper-affability. Yet on paper Napoleon's invasion plans were elaborate and spectacular. 60 specially designed gunboats, with capacity to carry 1,000 men, were ordered constructed and another 14,750 troops were to be conveyed across the Channel in 2 fishing boats. Both gunboats and fishing vessels were deployed over a very wide range: Honfleur, Dieppe, Caen, Fécamp, St. Valery, Rouen, Le Havre, Calais, Boulogne, Ambleteuse, Etaples and Dunkirk were all to be embarkation points. And because the French now had the Dutch as allies, Antwerp and Ostend were to be used as well. Particularly high hopes were pinned on the gunboats designed by the Swedish engineer Muskine, who had long argued that the flank of the Royal Navy could be turned by the use of such vessels. Armed with a 24-pounder in the bows and a field piece in the stern, these boats were the cynosure of Napoleon's invasion project. In January 1, 798 the Minister of Marine wrote to him, "I remark with pleasure that by means of large and small gunboats, Muskine's craft, the new constructions, and the fishing boats of the district, the Havre flotilla can carry 25,800 troops for landing." While his military preparations proceeded satisfactorily, Napoleon continued to cultivate his image as savior. He knew he could seize power in a moment, especially as he had incriminating evidence from D'Entraigues' intercepted correspondence to blacken and discredit most of the leaders of the Directory, but, using that genius for timing that was such a feature of his battles, he judged that the fruit was not yet ripe. Meanwhile his immense popularity played into his hands. Songs, poems, even paintings reinforced the propaganda message he had initiated in Italy. A play based on his Italian exploits, Le Pont de Lodi, was a smash hit at the theatre, and the street where he lived, Rue Chantereine, was renamed Rue de la Victoire. Yet Napoleon proceeded cautiously. He knew that the bubble of a reputation could burst overnight, as it had with Hoche, and that a single unguarded aside could be the trigger for a change in fickle public opinion. He therefore burnished his performance as the Republican hero whose active life is over and who wishes to devote himself to the disinterested pursuit of science and knowledge. He sat through official receptions and banquets taciturn and poker-faced, attended the theater without ceremony in a private box, refusing all offers by theater managers of gala performances, and held dignified and quiet dinner parties. He assumed the vacant seat at the institute left by Carnot's departure, and milked the action for symbolism by taking up the seat on Christmas Day I 797. His entry into the first class of the institute was a clever piece of Machiavellianism, winning the support of the ideologues and the intelligentsia. Thereafter he was frequently seen in the company of the institute crowd and assiduously attended its meetings, seated between Laplace and the other great mathematician Joseph Lagrange. Next he concentrated on behind-the-scenes domination of the 5 directors and the elimination of troublesome rivals. Irritated with Augereau's independence, he had him removed from command of the important army of the Rhine and shunted into the backwater of the Pyrenees command. Hearing that the directors were about to appoint Bernadotte to command of the army of Italy, he intervened with the objection that Bernadotte was too able a diplomat to be used as a mere commander and had him sent out to Vienna as the Directory's envoy to Austria. Meanwhile he attended the daily meetings of the Directory at the Luxembourg, ostensibly working on the continuing negotiations at Rastatt, on the future of the Rhine and on the proposed descent on England, but in reality bending the directors to his iron will. Only Barras held aloof, but the other 4 were soon reduced to the most craven currying of favor. They showed him secret police reports on the popular perception of Bonaparte, which were a melange of sycophantic nonsense specially brewed for the occasion. When the directors had their agents assassinate 2 young aristocratic hotheads at the Garchy coffee house, Napoleon dissociated himself from the act and called it murder. In alarm the directors sent him a deputation to justify their conduct as an act of exemplary terror. In January 1, 798 a fete had been arranged to commemorate the 5th anniversary of Louis XVI's execution. Both for personal and political reasons Napoleon did not want to be involved in such a controversial project, but the directors pressed him, alleging that his absence would be construed as a snub to them. Napoleon solved the problem by agreeing to appear at the ceremony on the 20th of January as a private person, part of a delegation from the institute. The incident anyway caused the directors embarrassment, for Napoleon was recognized as he entered the church of St. Sulpice, and the cry went up, "Long live the General of the Army of Italy." By the 27th of January 1798 Napoleon had had enough of the stifling boredom of the daily sessions at the Luxembourg that inevitably went on until dinner time. Joking but serious, he said to Barras that the way forward would be his own appointment as director, followed by a fresh coup by the 2 of them. Angered by Barras's frosty response to this overture, he pointedly absented himself from further meetings at the Luxembourg, mindful of the potentially murderous inclinations of the directors, as of royalists and ultra-Jacobins, none of them with cause to love him. He took careful precautions against an assassination attempt. Rubel recalled that Bonaparte took his own plates and cutlery to public functions, had his own private wine taster, and for a time tried to live on boiled eggs alone. Napoleon himself admitted to a daily fear of arrest, always had a horse waiting already saddled in his stable, and never removed his spurs during the day. In this tense atmosphere he scarcely needed anxiety from Josephine also, but, apart from keeping Barras ticking over calmly with her effusive letters, she merely added to his burdens in this period. The fact that she did not arrive in Paris until the new year of 1798 considerably embarrassed her husband. A fabulous display of sumptuous luxury and patriotic triumphalism was planned in the shape of a grand ball on Christmas Day, nominally to welcome home the hero's wife. When Josephine did not appear, the ball was cancelled and a new date set for the 28th of December. When Josephine still did not appear, a final date of the 3rd of January was set. Fresh from the embraces of Hippolyte Charles, the fading Creole beauty arrived in time for a quasi-royal evening, with Talleyrand as master of ceremonies. Napoleon's misogyny had already surfaced during his Roe December speech when the svelte Juliette Recamier had tried to upstage him. The glacial anger he displayed on that occasion was surely in part transference of his feelings towards Josephine. The anger Napoleon felt towards Josephine for embarrassing him was also projected onto Germaine de Staël, whom he already cordially disliked as an interfering feminist busybody who did not know her place, a woman, in his eyes, whose alleged beauty and brains were absurdly overrated. The ball was held in the great Hotel Galifet in the Rue Grenelle, and the contumacious Madame de Staël took it into her head to ambush the conqueror at the foot of the great staircase. There she plied him with a series of quick-fire questions on his attitudes to women, hoping for some gallant persiflage. At first Napoleon tried to freeze her out, but when Germaine refused to take the hint, and pressed on, he decided sterner measures were called for. "Which woman do you love and esteem most?" she asked. "My wife, of course," he replied coldly. "And which woman in history, alive or dead, do you most admire?" "Whoever has borne the most children," said the conqueror, pushing past her and leaving her agape with stupefaction. For a while Josephine played the dutiful wife at small dinner parties in the Rue de la Victoire, always playing the useful role of transmission belt to bearers, but once again her turbulent private life threatened to catch up with her. First there was a crisis over the unreturned love letters from Josephine to Hoche, which were highly incriminating. She implored Hippolyte Charles to help her and he in turn enlisted the aid of Roussillon de Saint Albin, guardian to Hoche's 19-year-old niece and heiress. Roussillon successfully retrieved the damning correspondence, but Josephine proved herself an ingrate and won Roussillon's undying enmity. The next and more serious crisis involved Charles himself. Napoleon learned from his spies, and a variety of other contacts including his brother Joseph, that Josephine was seeing Charles again, at a house in the Faubourg Saint-Honore belonging to M. Baudin. By this time Charles had resigned from the army but was putting his military experience to good personal use as a middleman, working on commission for the shady merchant house of Louis Baudin of Lyons, who specialized in supplies and provisions for the army, invariably of a shoddy or substandard kind. Charles knew the right contacts in the Ministry of War to set up lucrative contracts, involving multiple sweeteners and kickbacks for the principals involved. Because Josephine was a vital link in the chain, she too was on a retainer from Baudin, and had additionally used the Baudin-Charles network to smuggle diamonds looted in Italy into France, as part of a transaction utterly distinct from the official loot she had received from her husband. The latest wheeze cooked up by Josephine and Charles was a lucrative contract for supplying the entire army of Italy through Baudin. Apprised of what was afoot by his contacts, Napoleon confronted Josephine with his findings. Was she seeing her lover again after she had promised Napoleon faithfully not to do so after he had spared Charles's life in Italy? And did she have her hand in the till in the manner described? Josephine begged, pleaded, cajoled, wept, waxed piteously, and finally fainted. When she came to, she once more denied everything hysterically, threatened suicide and offered him a divorce if he did not believe her. Napoleon affected to be impressed. It is absurd to imagine, as some naive biographers do, that he actually believed her. What he wanted from Josephine was external submission, deference and respect, and what he feared most of all was a public scandal that would dent his reputation. He knew very well that she was continuing her affair with Charles, but for the reasons already adduced he enjoyed participating in his own secret humiliation, a masochistic urge made even more piquant by the quasi-sadistic way he would toy with Josephine and break her down. Napoleon actually cared more about the potential scandal from the army provisioning by the corrupt Baudin Company, but here Josephine successfully enlisted bearers to cover her tracks and obfuscate the record. A letter from Josephine to Charles on 9 March, the day after the dramatic showdown with Napoleon, is eloquent. Please tell Baudin to say that he does not know me, that it was not through me that he obtained the Army of Italy contract. Disillusioned with both Directory and Josephine, Napoleon departed on the 8th of February R798 for a 2-week tour of inspection of the Channel ports, traveling incognito from port to port through Normandy, Picardy, the Pass de Calais and Belgium, but concentrating on Boulogne, Calais and Dunkirk. In Belgium his itinerary took him to Nieuwpoort, Ostend, Antwerp, Ghent, and Brussels. In Antwerp he conceived a great plan for rebuilding the port installations, which he actually put in hand many years later. But his idea for taking his gunboats from Flushing to Dunkirk and Ostend by canal, thus avoiding the risk of British attack on the open sea, was foiled a little later by a British commando raid, when our Zoukrak troops destroyed the sluices of the Bruges Canal and many of the gunboats. The one positive achievement was that Napoleon followed in the footsteps of previous commanders of the French Army of England by concluding that Boulogne was a better launching point for an invasion than Calais. Although invasion preparations were reasonably well along in all the ports, Napoleon did not like what he saw. He had no confidence in the ability of his unwieldy flotilla to run the gauntlet of the Royal Navy. In his heart he still believed in the traditional French military thinking that an invasion of England was possible only after a victory at sea. Even if it were possible, he reasoned, for small vessels to cross the channel under cover of darkness, this could be done only in the winter when the nights were long, since the estimated time for a crossing was 8 hours MMT. By spring such an operation was no longer feasible, and, as everything would not be ready before April 1, 798, that seemed to rule out the possibility of a descent on England. On the 23rd of February, 3 days after returning to Paris via Saint-Quentin, Douai and La Fère, Napoleon indited a long letter to the directors, setting out his reasons why he considered an invasion of England chimerical. However hard we try, we will not achieve naval supremacy in a few years. To undertake an invasion of England without being masters of the sea would be the boldest and most difficult operation ever carried out and would require the long nights of winter. After the month of April it would be impossible to attempt anything. He suggested instead either throwing in the towel and concluding peace terms with England or launching an attack on Hanover which, though it might ignite a premature war in Europe, would at least chime with the analysis he made elsewhere of Beres and his colleagues. The Directory was dominated by its own weakness. In order to exist it needed a permanent state of war just as other governments need peace. Next day there was a stormy meeting in the Directory. The 5 directors seemed unable to grasp that Bonaparte was actually refusing to proceed with the descent on England. They asked him what his terms were. When he replied with what he thought were impossibly steep demands, they agreed to meet them. In frustration he suggested deputizing his protégé General Caffarelli du Falga as de facto commander of the invasion attempt, but Rubel countered by putting up his own candidate, who would not be under Bonaparte's thumb. At this point Napoleon lost his temper and exclaimed, "Do what you will, but I am commanding any descent on England." His threat to resign if the directors were dissatisfied was met by the now equally agitated Rubel with a histrionic flourish. "Here is a pen. The Directory awaits your letter." At this point Beres, realizing that there might soon be blood on the streets of Paris, before he had considered his own position carefully enough, intervened to pour oil on troubled waters. Napoleon promised to let the 5 have a memorandum on his further thinking. What Napoleon did not say in his letter of the 23rd of February was that his own future prospects precluded a descent on England. This was a venture fit for a political gambler betting on a rank outsider, and Bonaparte was too well ensconced to need to take such risks. He had never yet been associated with failure and did not intend to start in the Channel. But how to prevent his star from slipping over the horizon? After 3 months on a precarious political tightrope in France, his luster was beginning to dim. He had either to engineer a coup and make himself the absolute ruler of France, or he had to win fresh laurels in the field. With this in mind, he included yet another possible scenario in his letter to the directors. If he could not emulate his hero Julius Caesar by setting foot in England as a conqueror, he would rival his other hero Alexander the Great by winning glory in the East. His thoughts now increasingly turned to Egypt.